Hmm.
Okay, and when you sign in, you'll see something I will say, self workshop. I'm going to start the class, which is needed for you to be able to join it. And there we go. And this is what you'll see as an instructor. We'll hold off on that for just a second though. Up until 3 years ago, we were using up until the pandemic, we were using iClicker Classic, which was primarily done using the physical clickers, but students could use an app with it. After the pandemic, we moved to iClicker Cloud, which is the current version of iClicker. And while you can still use physical clickers with it, if you're in a classroom that has a receiver, it costs more for students, and and they're also more likely to forget it. Students are very unlikely to forget their smartphones, and it also is free to students. The institution is picking up the price of iClicker Cloud. It costs $4 per student per semester that they use it. And it doesn't matter whether they're using it in one class or in 5 classes. It still costs $4 per student. Before that, students would have to buy physical clickers, which used were generally about $22 to $25, which new cost up to $45. If they use a physical clicker, or for the app, they had to pay by either the semester or by the year. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the mobile app has been working really well, and it increases the opportunity, the types of questions that we can ask. Because when students were using physical clickers, they pretty much could only respond to multiple choice questions. You could trick them into doing numeric responses, but it was a bit of a challenge. So this gives us a much wider range of topics. Okay, so let me know when you're connected.
I'm in.
Okay. And Elise, have you been able to log in?
Yeah, I joined the class on the web browser.
Okay, good. So yeah, you can, either way will work, and that's true for students too. So let's just do a quick question. We're going to do a poll here, and the poll we're going to do is just a free response, so a short answer response. So you can say whatever you want. It'll be the names won't be popping up, so we're going to choose this display. And what it does is it captures the screen image of whatever is on the screen. So if you want to use polling questions, you can put them on in a Word document if you want. You can embed them in PowerPoint slides, Google Slides, in whatever presentation technique you're using. Just put the question on the screen. And what will happen is it will capture the screen. So in your grade book or in the record of what happened in the class for both you and the students, it does a screen grab so that you can see what the question students were responding to, and students who go back and look at their performance can see what the questions were, what their response was, and whether they got it right or wrong after the fact. So so right now I left this as a count up. When I use this in class, I usually use a count down, with more time given to responses that are short answer, because it takes longer to type in a response. Now, with only a few people using it, are you using it by any chance? Okay, so we only have 2 people using it, so we're not going to get very elaborate responses in terms of graphic displays, but we have, there we go, we've got 2. So I'm going to stop the polling right there. And now what I normally do is, if I were using a separate screen, I'd show the results there and look at them, and then choose whether to display it. With questions like this, I'll normally, just put them up. And here, the 2 major issues are information literacy skills and testing. Okay, and now if you have dozens of students or hundreds of students, as I do in my large class, you could also generate a word cloud to show the relative frequencies of terms with no terms in common here. That's not going to be very useful, but it shows they're all equally weighted in that distribution of 2 responses there. But
Can I ask a question, John?
Yes, sure.
So all I'm seeing, it says total responses 2, but it doesn't show me what they are.
Right.
Okay.
But if you look at the screen that I'm sharing with you, you should see them there.
I actually just see folder titles. I see your folders.
Oh,
You have the screen.
I shared the wrong screen. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
So I'm gonna stop. I don't do this normally. Well, okay. Let me try that again. This time I'm going to try sharing the correct screen so you can actually see what I was seeing. Sorry.
Okay.
It's been a long year. Okay, so so now you should see, okay, now you should see, let me close that. Now you should see the screen, and let me get those results back up there again. And these were the results, and that's what I meant to show. Okay, sorry about that. So, and I showed the word cloud. This time I'll show it so you can see it. There were, a limited number of words that were all equally weighted. But if you did have a lot of responses, you could see what terms were coming up repeatedly. And sometimes people will do is to ask the mood of the class, how students are feeling that day, just to get a sense for the general emotional state of the class and so on. And that, could be used to help prompt the types of activities you may choose to do. Now, so how might you use polling? And we'll do again a short answer. And this is again how it would typically look to students. They'd see the questions on the screen, and it's also going to be captured. So I'll start this again. It's capturing the desktop. Because I have multiple screens here, it tells me which one is being captured. Now you can also do this you can also start and stop the polls from your iPhone or Android phone, or from a tablet computer, or from any web browser. So some people will bring in a second computer or will use a phone for this. If you have two monitors, the best way to do it is to use a second monitor. If, for example, you might want to ask a question, see the results, and then ask students to discuss it, vote on it, and then vote on it again. And then don't share the results until the second time they've had to vote, sort of like a think, pair, share activity. Okay, so we've got 3 responses now. So I'll stop this polling and we will look at the results. And icebreaker activities, that's certainly a good use of it. You could embed in PowerPoints for use for attendance. You can do that for attendance. If you're only going to do it for attendance, though, it doesn't cost the college anything. So if the students are only in your course, it's free if it's attendance only. When you create the course, you have that option. But if you want to do anything other than just attendance type questions, if you want to do, if you want to use it for polling attitudes or student perceptions, student learning, or, just to get their opinions for whatever, then it does cost $4 per student, but CTS is picking up the cost. And many large classes are using this. So if you're teaching one of the smaller classes like the GST 103 classes or something else, there's a very high likelihood that students will already have access to an account. So I know even pre-pandemic, I would guess 70 or 80% of the students in my large class of up to 400 students also were enrolled in one or more other courses where they were using clickers. And I suspect we're getting back in that direction again. It had dropped off during the pandemic because it wasn't working remotely, but it's been picking up. Okay, so that's one type of question. And here's another question, and this is going to be, you notice it says select all that applies. So this is actually a multiple answer one where students can pick, oops, let me go back again and try that again and do it correctly. So this is a multiple answer question, and I'm going to go back and to the right. Okay, here we go. One more time. I don't usually do it on this computer. So select any of these that apply. Okay, we've got 3 responses. I'll stop it. And this gives us a breakdown and all of them were picked. And those are things I would argue are all reasonable uses of poem. You could use it to address student metacognition. It's a quick check. It can give you a quick knowledge check of whether students have understood something, which not only tells us what students understand, but also helps students understand what they understand and what they don't understand. It gives students immediate feedback on something. So if you're giving a presentation or something, or if they've done some reading and they think they understand it, giving them some questions in class is a good way of helping them do a little quick knowledge check. And if they're understanding things, gives them some reassurance. If they're not understanding, it's better that they get the feedback immediately rather than they go into a higher stake graded activity where they discover on a test that they don't understand it quite as well. It gives students real-time information on student understanding. So if you're giving a presentation or a lecture on some topic, it lets you know what students are understanding or not. So if all the students are understanding something, or that you do this at the start of class and it turns out they all have done the readings before class and they've understood it, you don't have to waste class time on topics that students do come in with understanding of. If you find that students are not doing so well on a topic, you can do some just-in-time teaching and focus more on the topics that students are having problems with. In large classes in particular, it's really easy for students to lose focus no matter what types of activities you're doing. But when they're getting a question like this, it brings them back into focus almost immediately. So if there's some discussions going on in the back of the class and then they're suddenly asked a question, all of a sudden there's going to be, if you're giving them the opportunity to discuss it before voting on it, either at the first stage or the second, it's going to get loud when they're discussing it. But then after that, they're going to want to know what the answer is, and they get quiet right back down again. They quiet down, and it builds curiosity because they've taken a position and they want to know whether it's correct. Eric Mazur gave a talk here about 10 years ago now, I think, or it was 9 or 10 years ago. And one of the things he did, and I think Jessica has heard this before, what he did is he asked all the faculty who were in his workshop, what happens to the size of a hole in a plate of metal if you heat it up in the oven? Will the hole become larger or smaller? And so people voted on that. And then he had them discuss it. And the discussion got really loud and people were going back and forth. And he said, and now let's vote again. And he said, look at how engaged you were on that. If I were to ask you, if I were to lecture to you about what happens to the hole in the plate of metal when you heat it to a certain temperature, it would be about the most boring lecture you could imagine. But here you all were taking a stand, you were debating it, and now you want to know what the answer is. And that's why using clickers can be really effective. And then he moved on to his next slide, and people were angry. They wanted him to tell them, well, what happened? They wouldn't let him go on without hearing an explanation. And he did that intentionally just to demonstrate the point that people were now curious about something that they generally wouldn't really care all that much about because they committed to it. So that's where that bringing students back to focusing comes in, that people are now curious, they want to understand it, and it helps refocus the class so you can get started on the next activity. You can also use it to get information about what students' preconceptions and prior knowledge is. And as we said before, just checking in with students on how things are going. That can be really helpful just to get a mood, a feel for the general mood of the class. And here's we're going to switch over to go through each of the types of questions that you might use. This is just a more traditional multiple choice. So I'm going to go up here to multiple choice. And then there were 2 classroom studies done. One was by, well, there have been many, but 2 of the ones that are cited the most were done by Eric Mazur and some of his colleagues in physics and Carl Wyman in chemistry. And they found that using clickers with peer instruction resulted in average learning gains compared to classes where they were not used that were, oops, one more time. I'm going to click this and I'll let you vote. And now what would normally happen is I would have the screen with the results on a display on the other screen so I could see what's coming in, and then make a decision as to whether people would discuss it again. But here we're just going to go through this and take a look. And we've got 2 people voted for B and 1 for D. So in fact, in their studies, D was correct, that in Eric Mazur physics found that the student learning gains from a pre-test. I should have described the environment. What happened is students were given a concept test, a test at the beginning before they went over the material on some basic concepts. And then there was a lecture on it interspersed with clicker questions in one class and without the clicker questions in the others. And he found learning gains that were 3 times as large for the students where clickers were used on those topics. Carl Wyman in chemistry found learning gains of only about a little over 200%. But in both cases, the whole distribution was shifted far over to the right in relatively large classes with multiple sections and so forth. So, you know, students ended up learning 2 to 3, well, the difference in the scores from before they talked about the concepts to when they were tested at the end in classes with clickers were 2 to 3 times as large, basically, which is pretty substantial. Now, most studies don't find, in other disciplines, don't find learning gains quite that large. So they often find learning gains of 50%, 75%, or 100% and so forth. But in pretty much every study I've seen, particularly in STEM fields, but everywhere, you end up with some significant improvements in student learning. And an interesting thing is, in some experiments, they've tested students recall a year after these experiments, and they found that the learning gains that were received by the use of clickers and interactive lectures in classes persisted for at least a year, that students recalled more when clickers had been used in their introductory classes. So I don't know of any studies that went beyond a year, partly because it's hard to keep track of students over time, and it's hard to measure how much the effect is due to that one intervention. Now, here's another type of question. This I put together a little while ago. But let's say there were 100 new COVID cases in the first week, and then let's say the weekly cases were rising by 10% per week. How many cases would be expected 2 weeks later? So again, it's 100 now, and the question is, how many would be showing up 2 years later if they're growing by 10% per week? So I'm going to start the polling, and now you can enter a numeric response. You don't have to get it corrected. This is mostly just to show how this works. In fact, students don't generally get all the questions correct, which is useful too. One more question, one more result. You can take a guess. There we go. Okay, so I'll stop this and then we'll take a look at the results. And no, turns out none of these are right, but that's okay. What happens is after 1 week, if it grows by 10%, the following week there should be 110 new cases, because that's 10% more. But the week after that, you've got compounding. So it's 10% more than 110, which would be 121, because, so it's that continuous compounding. But it's a good way of testing some concepts, numeric concepts. And another type of question, and I don't expect anyone, unless they've had economics courses recently, to get this correct, but this is one where you can, now I put letters in there because I actually tried this as a target question, and it was a little hard to interpret when you had 400 dots showing up on the screen, so I just went back to multiple choice with this. But what I'm going to do here is we're going to do a target type question, which is right here. And what this allows you to do is to select an answer using either your phone, the touchpad on a phone or a tablet, or the mouse on your computer screen. And this could be used if you were doing some type of quiz involving maps, or if you were teaching using an art class, or if you wanted the students just to pick some image on a screen of anything that you put there where there's a correct response. And what this will do is it will display the choices that students made, and then you can select which ones are correct and incorrect. We'll do that in just a minute. Okay, we've got 3 responses, so we'll stop. And now when we look at the results, what happens is the responses are right there. And actually, those are all related to the impact of the tax. But the bottom one is a part of the share that's borne by the, the top one is borne by the consumers, because it's the amount by which the price increases in response to a tax. So 2 of these turned out to be correct. We're pretty close to it. There we go. Let me see. So I should be able now to select the correct. Well, actually, really only the top one is, because that's in the dead weight loss area. But we'll just say both of those are correct and save it. And that will be marked as correct in the grade book once the scores are assigned. And oh, and one thing I didn't illustrate, but as an instructor, you could go back and none of those were correct. So we'll leave them incorrect. But here, this was a correct answer. And so when you go over it in class, if there is a correct answer, you can just flag it as correct. And similarly, in the case before, each of these were correct answers, so you can flag them all as correct. And all that's automatically graded. Again, if you're using this in a graded manner, and that gets uploaded at the end of class into, well, you have to do a minor bit of work to get it uploaded, but it will upload right into the student grade book in Brightspace if you choose to use it that way. And so you can use it. I already mentioned this. I'd strongly encourage not making students buy physical clickers. We had some faculty who were really resistant to students using mobile devices in class. I think most people have gotten past that since the pandemic, but the only reason I could see why people would not use the software version of this is because they don't want students to have a laptop or a mobile phone active in class, but it's so much easier and so forth. And again, when students were using physical clickers, sometimes they'd leave them at home. Sometimes the batteries would go dead. Sometimes they'd break, not often, but more typically the batteries would go dead. And sometimes students would, one of the issues we used to have back in the old times when we were using just these clickers, is that students who wouldn't go to class would sometimes pass on their clickers to other students, and you'd have someone in the back row with one clicker on the desk and 2 or 3 of other under the desk where they'd be voting for themselves and their classmates. And the nice thing about using mobile devices is that very few students will give other students their mobile phones to take in to vote for them. Very few students will let the batteries go dead for their phones, or if they do, they'll have a charger which they can plug in somewhere in class. And very few students will forget to bring their mobile phones to class. So, it's a device that students pretty much always have with them, and it works really simply and easily, as I hope you've just seen. So, so that's all I wanted to present, I think. Let me just make sure there's nothing else. It's integrated with Brightspace, and that's really simple to do. And you don't have to worry about having it on the USB drive. It's already installed on the desktops of all the computers. You just click on it, you log in as the instructor, and then it's ready to go. And when you're finished, all the results get stored in the iClicker cloud. And then after class, you would then go in. If you haven't assigned which questions are correct, you can then do so. If you decided that some of your questions were vague, you could delete them and they get excluded from the student gradebooks. And then you just click on a button and it will automatically upload it into your Brightspace gradebook. And that's pretty much it. So, any questions? A couple of things I should mention first. Students tend to really find this enjoyable. They tend to find it really easy to use. And, there's a little bit of gamification going on with it. And it's much more fun than just having students passively sit there. And you can combine it with other active learning activities, you know, to engage students.
This looks great. I can definitely see using this in my library instruction one-shots for sure.
Mhm.
So thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions?
I can't think of any right now, but I'll definitely hit you up if I think of something.
Okay, and we do workshops on setting up the account. Actually, we're doing one later this week, but we have old ones recorded, and we'll be doing them again before the spring or the fall semester. Yeah, it's fall and coming up before the fall semester starts. So, but it's really easy to do. Basically, you set it all up by going to the website, and you just connect it to your course, and you're done.
It seems really easy. I think I was thinking it was like more of something more difficult. So I'm happy to see how easy it is.
It really is. It's easy to use, and because it's capturing whatever's on your screen, it's, you know, it doesn't really require much setup. There are some other polling settings where you have to build the question into the PowerPoint using or into slides using a plugin, and this is just simpler.
Yeah, it looks
There's
great.
some instructors who just will do questions on the fly by opening up the Notes app and typing a question there, and it just grabs that and puts it in so you can see what the question was. And you don't have to do things graded. You could, if you choose to do some grading with it, you could choose to do it based simply on whether or not students answered. So you could use it as a participation grade rather than having correct and incorrect answers, depending on how you're using it or the purpose of using it in class.
This is great. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Good seeing you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.